All right, folks, welcome. If you're watching this, then you're here on my channel. Thank you so much for checking it out. I really do appreciate it. This channel is a brand new channel that I just created. And the goal of the channel is to kind of give you an opportunity to kind of take a look at some older works that were created in fantasy, science fiction, and horror genres. Most of them were before I was born in '76. A few of them will come later. We'll talk about a few things in the later '70s and the '80s. But as a general rule, my goal is to kind of present you with a lot of some of the older works that are out there that are great. People that might not have known about them, or they may have been lost kind of to time, and to kind of bring them back out and give them another opportunity to shine in the sun, in the modern daylight here in 2018, 2019, and so forth. So the goal of the channel then is to bring you a lot of these sort of older sort of things that are out there. Now, as a little bit of context, who am I? Well, I'm somebody who's read a whole lot of science fiction, fantasy, and horror stuff. When I was a little kid, I started reading a lot of the sort of choose your own adventure stuff, and the first sort of choose your own adventure story, The Dragon's Den, is a fantasy one. And I found this to be incredibly different. It's not a particularly good fantasy story. The characters are very much a trope, the sort of things that you would expect and such. But I found it to be very compelling. There was something there that just gripped me. That sort of a heroic fantasy setting. I just loved it. I just really clung to it. So I started pursuing a lot of other sort of fantasy projects later on. The next fantasy project I turned to were other game books, specifically this beat-up book from the Lone Wolf series. This is the second book in the series. It's actually the first one I picked up off the shelf at a Walden Books and actually read. I read it about a couple of months after I read The Dragon's Den, and it kind of opened up my eyes again to this sort of strong, heroic fantasy world, and I really became engaged, and I would go out and buy all the different books in this series as quickly as possible so I could keep reading it. And then, because I wasn't able to get my fix with all the game books that I was picking up, I also started picking up other books to read, just normal sort of stories. My first major story that I read was The Hobbit, right afterwards. I pursued a classic sort of fantasy for children and such, and I loved it. I thought it was great. And then in the summer, between my 5th and 6th grade years, I committed to reading the sequel, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And it took me the entire summer to read. It was really incredibly long, engrossing, and detailed. But I came out of it very much changed. I very rarely would go and read more children's books. From then on, I would tend to read more adult books. It was kind of the change. And I really sort of committed full scale to the sort of fantasy style of being. The next book I'd actually read was still a child's book. It was Anne McCaffrey's Dragon Song. And then I would go and read the rest of that trilogy. But then after that, I just committed to more adult stuff. Of course, one of my passions during that time would be stuff like R.A. Salvatore, who was my favorite writer in high school after I picked up his Crystal Shard and subsequent works. And when I went to college, I was pretty much strongly within the fantasy camp. I love fantasy. I'd read so much fantasy stuff. I really considered myself to be really kind of committed to fantasy. And then a little bit changed when I entered my sophomore year in college. And Del Rey was a publisher that I definitely was committed to. I thought they made a bunch of really strong quality fantasy works. And they published this H.P. Lovecraft sort of group of his stories, some of his best stories, in the horror genre. And so I picked that up in my sophomore year in college and read that and just came in love with the different style of storytelling. He's an incredible wordsmith, an incredible strong horror writer, and so I really started to commit myself to expanding and doing a bunch of his stuff and some of his peers. And some of his peers included Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard and lots of other things in the Cthulhu mythos, both later, and also earlier works that were kind of adopted and absorbed in. And so then I kind of committed to horror. And since my sophomore year in college until now, I've probably read more horror than any other two genres combined that you could pick. I really love that, particularly older horror stories that kind of, before it was genrefied. I mean, today it's hard to tell a story without having zombies, because you know what zombies are going to be like, and so forth, and there are all these sort of strong tropes that they have. This was before that, and when people were still writing fresh kind of horror stuff, which I really enjoyed. And then about 5 or 6 years after college, I started committing myself to science fiction. I wanted to read some of the older science fiction stories that were out there. and kind of commit myself kind of really kind of exploring what science fiction had to offer. Everything from post-apocalyptic to military science fiction and such became my next group of books that I tackled, with some big names following. And then about 5 or 6 years ago, I really committed myself to the pulp era and the Penny Dreadful era that came beforehand. I love that stuff, particularly from the Lovecraft and on. And I pushed myself into Edgar Rice Burroughs, Sax Rohmer, H. Rider Haggard, and such, and pushed myself even outside of the normal 3 genres into things like spy, adventure, and such, and everything from Lost World to detective stories to westerns in that genre. I began to read with panache. I just love that earlier stuff. And I've read everything from Tarzan to John Carter of Mars. So that kind of gives you a kind of a context of where I am, where I'm coming from. I've read a lot of stuff, and I really want to kind of give an opportunity to kind of unpack it here in front of you with this video channel on YouTube. So basically, I'm hoping that this will help you out in one of 3 ways and will connect with you. The first is, if you've read some of these great works that we're going to be talking about in these channels, then I want you to respond in the comments field. I'd be happy to engage you with what you thought of them, if you thought my review was good or bad, or you think that I was, maybe mischaracterized something in a various way, or if you thought something I said was particularly insightful. I'd love to talk with you about that more in the YouTube comments. Secondly, if you're somebody who has heard of some of these things, but you've never really gotten a chance to kind of do research on them or find out if this is something for you or not, then I definitely want to unpack that for you too and give it a chance to kind of look at those. For example, Jack Vance from The Dying Earth is one of my favorite fantasy stories ever told. And if you have familiar with Dungeons & Dragons, you may be familiar with the fact that his kind of style of magic has created this sort of modern Vancian style of magic in a lot of fantasy that came past. So you might have heard of his name or the story or heard of its impact without ever actually reading the story itself. And it's incredibly good. So in a future video, we'll talk about Jack Vance's Dying Earth and how great it is and why it's so different and interesting and how influential it was in a number of different ways, from fantasy to science fiction. So that's just an example as a second way of kind of, if you have heard of these things, but you haven't gotten a chance to kind of look at them, we'll give you a chance to kind of put it on your plate. And then finally, my hope is that there are going to be some things out there that we talk about that you've never actually heard of before. And you get a chance to say, okay, that's something I might be interested in taking a look at and reading. For example, here soon I'm going to do a video on the first military science fiction story ever told. And it's in the 1800s. So you might not have ever even heard of it or even knew that this story existed and how influential it was on so many different writers, like H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds. So we're going to take a look at some of these things, give you a chance to take a look at them, and if you have read them, or if you were thinking about reading about them, or after hearing about them, you do want to read about them, then hopefully this channel will be for you. Again, thank you so much for watching this video, and hopefully some future videos as well. You have a